Welcome back to my video series on the Kowa Spoke Cutter. This video is about minor maintenance, and this is really minor maintenance. Toothbrush, cloth, heavy oil like Phil Wood Tenacious Oil, lightweight oil like Tri-Flow synthetic oils. Pretty much all you need to do this minor maintenance. First things first, pivot pin. This pivot pin also acts like a bearing. Connects this handle to the slider. I like to wipe this off once in a while. Take heavy oil like Phil Wood Tenacious Oil. Put a good bead of oil across the entire thing. Spread it around with my finger. Insert it all the way back in. A 1/4 inch of that pivot pin will stick out the back end. I'll put a drop or a bead of oil on it. Let it seep a little bit. And then I'll pull that oil in the backside by pulling the pivot pin back out a little bit and then putting it back in. And then turn it a few times. And that keeps it lubricated, minimizing the wear and tear on it. It's very important that when you're done using heavy oil that you wipe off any excess heavy oil. You do not want heavy oil working its way down to the bottom of the slider. But if you let heavy oil get on the bottom of the slider, it will stick to the grommet on a post in the catch can and pull it right off its post. If you want to avoid that, you can use Tri-Flow instead. Slider body has a plate on it. You can use Phil Wood oil again, or any heavy oil. Put a very thin coating on there. Make sure you wipe off any excess. You're putting on a very thin film. And then running it up and down several times passes it on to the bearings, lubricating them as well. Again, wipe off any excess heavy oil, such as Phil Wood Tenacious Oil, because if you don't, it will work its way to the bottom of the slider, sticking to the grommet in the catch can, pulling it off its post. If you worry about that happening, you can use lightweight oil instead on the slider and bearings. It will never stick to the grommet. When it gets to the bottom of the slider, it won't happen. If I'm rolling a set of spoke where it's okay for the spokes to be oiled on the threads, I'll lubricate the dies using lightweight oil. A couple drops is all that's needed. Rolling the first spoke, we'll take that oil and spread it to the second die, the stationary one. Or, you can pull the pivot pin out, pull the slider body out, and put lightweight oil on the stationary die and this die. And while you're in there, use a brush to clean out. You can even use the brush to scrape off gunk on your dies. An old toothbrush will do the job. Put that back in very gently. Let's come around to the back side. And let's point the camera right here, right at the cutter area. On this cutter actuated lever is a bearing. That's a bearing. That's the pivot pin for it, and this is the plunger. That bearing pushes the plunger. And that plunger pushes the cutting body forward and then back. I like to clean the bearing off, the pivot off, and the plunger off, and then oil them with a heavy oil like Phil Wood Tenacious Oil. It doesn't require much at all. Put on the bearing, turn the bearing a little bit. Lightly contact the plunger with the bearing, spreading some of the oil to the plunger. And then put a small drop on the pivot and actuate that too as well, but it too is also touching the bottom of the plunger. By keeping the pivot pin lubricated, by keeping this bearing, the plunger, and the pivot lubricated for the cutting handle, it reduces wear and tear and will help them last longer. The same for the plate and the bearings behind the slider. When doing this minor maintenance, one thing you want to do is actuate this lever several times, no spoke inside. You also want to do this when you're cutting and threading spokes, and here's why. The cutting assembly is a closed cavity with a very tight fitting cutter body inside. You do not want any debris in here. You do not want chipping to occur in here or a burr to develop in here. This should go very smoothly forward, and when released, it should do that all by itself. If you actuate this and it feels like there's some grime or debris in there, you need to clean it out right away. If it feels like there's chipping in there or a burr that you're forcing the cutter to go by or slide across, you need to stop right away, disassemble the whole cutting unit, inspect and clean and repair if necessary. That will actually be covered in a later video. So always take the time when you're cutting and threading spokes and when doing lubrication to inspect this. Should be nice and smooth going forward and back, no stickiness, with a nice good solid return. There's one more area to cover here for minor maintenance, and that is the catch can. This is the catch can right here. This is where your spoke bends fall into, and here's a red knob that pulls off a lid. I have a paint bucket on the floor that I use to catch spoke ends, and you can actually come in here and remove them. This is a custom ramp that I made. This is not from Kowa. You don't want to let more than a ½ inch of material build up inside here. If you allow more than a ½ inch of material in here, two things are going to happen. Number one, the slider body is not going to come all the way down and rest on the post that's in there. There's a post down here with a rubber grommet on it. You don't want to bury that. And if you let it build up too much, a long spoke end will come partway down this tube to the bottom of the machine, hit the pile of spokes, and not come all the way out. Next thing you know, you can't feed any more spokes in. So after several hundred spokes or about a ½ inch of material, make sure you clean out your catch can. And that's that. And that's really all there is for minor maintenance on the Kowa Spoke Cutter. In future video segments, I'm going to cover bearing removal and replacement, die removal, replacement, and rotation, and I'm also going to cover taking out the cutter assembly, inspecting, and putting it back in. Those are in future videos coming up soon. And until next time, see you then.